Hello and welcome back to our discussion of the philosophy of love and friendship. Today we are talking about Socrates. He's obviously a huge deal as far as the Symposium is concerned, and there's a lot to talk about with him, and we need to kind of contextualize his whole deal in order to understand exactly what's going on here in the Symposium. Because there's actually a lot of subtext about Socrates and his various relationships and doings in Plato's dialogues in general, and in this one especially. But I want to stress, part of the goal of the Philosophy of Love and Friendship class here at Ramapo is that this is a history class. I know, we're all very grumpy about it, but at the end of the day, I have to teach history, and we have to talk about historiography, and we have to fulfill all the requirements that the Gen Ed board requires of us, and that's okay, because there's actually a lot of cool stuff to talk about here. But what I want to stress is that when it comes to the discussion of this guy, Socrates, we need to understand his life and career from a couple of different perspectives. We need to reckon with the fact that there is not just one story of Socrates, but two. And this is often the case for major historical figures and events. In fact, there's probably more than two stories. It's probably immensely complicated. That's how these things tend to work. Like, if you were to talk about any contemporary historical figure, take, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, chances are you would do a pretty incomplete job if you just represented them according to one particular faction or one particular person's perspective. A truly robust understanding of either one of the figures should take into account both the perspectives of his supporters and the perspective of his opponents, and the actual stuff that he did while he was in office, and so on and so forth. So with that in mind, I want us to start getting comfortable looking at these historical events the same way, reckoning with the fact that there maybe aren't necessarily two sides to every story. Sometimes there is just the truth and that's all there is to it. But most of the time when you're trying to unpack what a person's legacy is or what a historical event was like, it's to your advantage to look at as many differing perspectives as possible and try and suss out who might have the better attitude, the better outlook, who's telling the truth and who's lying, and if they're telling the truth, why are they telling the truth, and if they are lying, why are they lying? Look for these biases, look for these assumptions, and it will help make you better scholars, better historians, better philosophers, better readers in general. So with that in mind, when we talk about Socrates, we need to take into account the two perspectives given to us by, on the one hand, Plato and the philosophical world in general, who tend to love this guy, and the perspective of the classical historians and classics departments around the world, which honestly are not nearly as excited as we philosophers tend to be. Socrates is a complicated guy, so let's talk about the two stories about what Socrates' deal tends to be. Again, the first story we're going to look at is the one that Plato gives us. Plato is the guy we're studying here. He is, like I said, justly considered one of the most important philosophers who ever lived. His take on Socrates is pretty definitive. And Socrates is a major character in virtually all of his dialogues. He keeps coming up. But most importantly for us, Plato has like a series of 4 dialogues-ish, where he describes basically the life and deaths of Socrates, like all the events leading up to Socrates' spoiler alert, execution. These are some of the earliest dialogues that Plato wrote in all likelihood, but nonetheless, the same ideas, the same sort of defense of Socrates is going to keep coming up in most of his dialogues. So, in the first few dialogues that this is really relevant to, you'll find Socrates is accused in the Euthyphro. He is accused specifically of corrupting the youth of Athens, and more specifically of raising up new gods and failing to honor the old ones. There's this whole discussion in the Euthyphro about, okay, so what is piety actually, and how are you supposed to worship the gods? And should you worship them unquestioningly, or should you just should you be able to come up with your own opinions about them? That's very much the relevant discussion of the Euthyphro. I've taught it many times. I love that dialogue. It's one of my favorites. But kind of the key one that we're going to be looking at today is in the Apology. The Apology is when Socrates basically is on trial and goes on the stand and defends himself. Apologia, the Greek word, does not mean apologize the way that we usually understand it now, where it's like, I'm so sorry I did that. I wish I could go back and not do it anymore. No, apology means to present a defense, to explain your actions. It is not, I'm sorry for what I did. It is, this is why I did what I did, and if you're not okay with it, then, that's whatever. It is not necessarily like an explanation that is meant to satisfy everyone, although most of the time that's how it works out. It's like, oh, well, if you were doing it in self-defense, then it's totally understandable, or something like that. Finally, in the Phaedo, Socrates does in fact die. Like, the whole discussion is, okay, so what is the soul? What is life after death going to look like? Is there an afterlife? What is that afterlife going to look like? And then finally it concludes with Socrates actually being executed. Like, the guard comes in and he gives him hemlock to drink, and Socrates drinks it. In fact, he drinks it gladly. He's like, I'm looking forward to being dead. Finally, I'll be able to, stop having to worry about my silly body or all the distractions that take place in life, and can devote my life entirely to philosophy. It's a whole thing. But like I said, we're focusing primarily on the apology here. And what I want to sort of give you as the Plato's description of who Socrates is and what his deal is basically coming beat for beat from the Apology. So, according to the Apology, once upon a time when Socrates was bumming around ancient Athens, there was this really important oracle just outside of Athens here in Delphi called the Oracle at Delphi, appropriately. And this is like the major oracle in the ancient world. Like, everybody goes here for advice about the future. The, Delphic oracle is devoted to Apollo, and Apollo is, like, personally giving the oracle, like, these visions of what the future is going to look like. And this is, like, a real place that exists. Like, this is what it looks like now, in case it isn't obvious that that's a photograph. The Oracle at Delphi remains, an obviously important complex, and we have lots of archaeological discoveries surrounding it. But even in ancient Greek mythology and ancient Greek literature, you can find all these references to Delphi all the time. If you are a farmer and you're like, okay, so when should I plant my crops? You go to the Oracle at Delphi, and it's like, well, it's going to snow again in 2 weeks, so maybe wait until after that. The farmer's like, oh, okay, and then he takes the advice and they go on about their business. So anyway, this oracle is really important, is regarded as the best source of information about the world and the future. And apparently this one random dude is going to the oracle at Delphi for reasons that are not entirely clear. And while he's there, he stops in and he's like, hey, since I'm here, who is the wisest man in Athens? And the oracle tells him why it's Socrates. So this random dude goes all the way back to Socrates, and he's like, Socrates, I was just talking to the oracle at Delphi, and I asked the oracle, who is the wisest man in Athens? And guess what, Socrates? She said it was you! You are the wisest man in Athens! And Socrates is like, no, that's not right. There is no way on this green marble we call Earth that I am the wisest man in Athens. And for that matter, I can prove it. There's a zillion teachers running around charging for their services who claim to be experts in all sorts of things, like experts in goodness, or experts in justice, or experts in beauty, or whatever. And all of them know more than I do. So all I need to do is, go up to one of them and find out how much they know, and I will prove to everyone that I am not the wisest man in Athens, because I didn't know the thing that they know, and consequently we can all put this silly rumor to bed. Now, these people that he's referring to, these teachers, are the people who are usually called the sophists. And the reason why the sophists exist are for the same stuff that we've been talking about for a little while now. Remember when we were talking about the family, and I mentioned that, the eldest child has to be, educated so they are ready to take their place in the ancient Greek world, and they can inherit their father's estate, and, go ahead and, rule the estate going forward. Well, here in Athens, since the entire, city-state is run with a democracy in mind, it is run by the rules of a democracy where everybody votes in order to get stuff done and to pass legislation and make decisions for the community, it becomes pretty obvious that, the way that you educate your young, son to become powerful and capable and, able to convince people in the demos to do what needs to be done for your family and your household is to help your son become very persuasive. Again, that's how democracy works. You need to learn rhetoric, oratory. You need to learn how to convince people that you are right and they are wrong. And consequently, there are all of these teachers who hire out their services, and they're like, hey, we can educate your son to be the most persuasive, smartest sounding person in ancient Athens, and they will totally like run the show in the demos, and your household will become rich and powerful and famous, and you'll accomplish all these great things, and for this low price we will come to you like every day and give them lessons. And there are quite a few of these sophists running around in ancient Greece. Probably the most famous is this guy, Gorgias. Plato actually has an entire dialogue where Socrates and Gorgias go head-to-head. It's one of the big famous Platonic dialogues, another one of those sort of middle period Platonic dialogues. Likewise, we've got this guy, Thrasymachus, who is a major character in quite a few of Plato's dialogues, but has a particularly famous section at the beginning of the Republic where he and Socrates square off. Or there's this guy, Protagoras. Protagoras is also kind of a big deal and has this whole idea that, like, the measure of everything is man. Like, that's his famous line. There's another famous dialogue where, like, Socrates squares off with Protagoras as well, and they talk about, like, justice and democracy and all sorts of fun things. So these are the guys who are running around ancient Athens saying, hey, we are the smartest people in Athens. These are the people that Socrates is referring to when he's like, obviously there are people who are wiser than I am. So he goes to talk to them. So, like, Socrates goes up to Gorgias, and he's like, hey, Gorgias, you are supposedly the guy who is the most knowledgeable about what is good. And Gorgias is like, yep, that's me, I'm Gorgias, you've probably heard of me, my going rates are... And Socrates is like, I just want to have a conversation. Because I want to establish that, like, you're so knowledgeable and so wise. So tell me, what is goodness? And Gorgias is like, goodness is doing what is in accordance with your nature. And Socrates is like, wow, that's pretty cool. Like, that sounds really good. So what is our nature then? And Gorgias is like, well, it is our nature to be the best version of ourselves and to do what is right for us. And Socrates is like, so it is good to do what's in our nature, but our nature is to do what is good? And Gorgias is like, well, yeah. And Socrates is like, well, that's not actually very helpful. Like, what should I do to become a good person? And Gorgias is like, well, do all the right things, Socrates. Like, do good things instead of bad things. And Socrates is like, you're just using the same words over and over again. Like, we need to talk about what specifically is goodness, not like why a thing, like, we need to talk about why an individual action is good or not. Like, if I kill a person, is it good? And Gorgias is like, no. But Socrates is like, what if I kill him, like, when I'm at war and, I'm defending my friend? And Gorgias is like, well, then it would be. And Socrates is like, so it is good sometimes, but it's not good at other times. And Gorgias is like, you know what, Socrates, this has all been very fascinating, but I have, other plans elsewhere that I have to go take care of right now. So, maybe we'll talk again some other time, but for now, like, bye. And Gorgias takes off. And Socrates is like, wow, that was not very informative or helpful. Maybe this Gorgias guy isn't all he's cracked up to be. Like, maybe he doesn't actually understand goodness the way that he thinks he does, because he seemed to fold pretty quick when I asked him some pretty basic questions about what goodness would actually be. So let's talk to somebody else. Let's talk to Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is all about justice. So we'll go to Thrasymachus and be like, okay, so what is justice? So he goes to Thrasymachus and he's like, hey, Thrasymachus, I hear that you're very knowledgeable about justice. Can you tell me what justice is? And Thrasymachus is like, justice is the will of the stronger. And Socrates is like, wow, that's hardcore. So like, if you're the stronger and you do something, it's always just 100% of the time? And Thrasymachus is like, that's what I said, Socrates. And Socrates is like, okay, so, like, let's say that, I'm the stronger guy, and I, like, kill somebody, but it turns out that person was, like, really useful to me, or really good at something, and therefore, like, I'm actually in a really bad place because I killed this person. Does that still hold? And Thrasymachus is like, yes, because you are the stronger and you do whatever you want to do. And Socrates is like, but in this case, like, I was the stronger, but then I, like, killed my own friend, and now I'm weaker, and then the other person who is the stronger person now can, like, get one over on me. So is it still really the right thing to do if by doing the thing that I thought was strong, I am now weak? And Thrasymachus is like, yes, you were strong, and now you are weak, and now the other guy is strong, and that guy is justice. And Socrates is like, so what if he hurts me? Like, what if I didn't want to be hurt when I was strong, but now he's hurting me because he's strong? Does that mean that he's more just than I was when I was strong? And Thrasymachus is like, Would you look at the time? I've got to go. Bye. And Socrates is like, well, that was also extremely unhelpful, and also maybe a little scary. Like, what is up with that guy? Maybe that was not a terribly productive conversation to have. So maybe Thrasymachus also doesn't know what he's talking about. Maybe all these guys are just blowing smoke out of their butt. So he goes to talk to Protagoras, and he goes to talk to Phaedrus, and he goes to talk to all the other sophists, and he has a similar conversation with them, and in every single case, he comes to the same conclusion. These guys don't know what they're talking about. Like Gorgias, Thrasymachus, Protagoras, they all talk a good game. They all sound very smart, and they have these like brilliant, witty aphorisms that immediately collapse the minute you try and ask questions about them. So at the end of the day, maybe I am the smartest man in Athens? Not necessarily because I know anything. Like, I still don't know what justice is, and I still don't know what goodness is, and I still don't know what beauty is, or any of this stuff. But I do know that I'm not wise. I'm not going around telling everybody how smart I am. I don't pretend to know things that I don't know, like these other guys apparently do. So I am wise because I am self-aware, because I am, in fact, aware of the fact that I am not wise. And, you know, if I have, like, zero wisdom, then that's still better than anyone who thinks they have wisdom and don't, because that's like negative wisdom. They are ignorant of their own ignorance. They're unaware of their own lack of information. And I want to stress, like, this revelation, the one that is presented in the Apology, this idea that Socrates is the wisest man in Athens specifically because he knows that he is not wise, this is the foundational principle of all of philosophy. Know thyself. Like, wisdom for philosophers is a recognition of how much we do not know. It is staring our own ignorance in the face. And I want to stress this because it is real easy for undergraduates to, like, get a little bit of philosophy and get super excited about it and run away thinking that they're, like, the smartest people in the world and just get smacked upside the head by, like, life and philosophers who actually know what they're talking about and people with PhDs and all sorts of things. I want to stress that when you hang out in academia, as a rule, the best metric of, like, how far you've come is how little you think you know. Not in some sort of imposter syndrome, like, oh my gosh, I am actually a really dumb person even though I've studied, you know, philosophy for literally dozens of years, but rather in the sense that any scholar worth their salt is going to look at the body of literature that exists and be like, wow, there is so much that I don't know. Like, yes, I've read all of the Platonic dialogues, but I wish I could get my hands on the missing ones. Or I wish that I could read the dialogues that Socrates supposedly wrote. Or I wish that, like, I could spend more time studying ancient Greek archaeology. Or I wish I could spend more time studying, like, different philosophers who have read Socrates and interpreted him in different ways. Like, as a rule, we are all falling well short of capital W wisdom. And this principle that Socrates lays out, that, like, wisdom is based on a recognition of one's own ignorance, this is foundational. But what I want to stress is that as much as Socrates has this brilliant revelation, you know thyself, notice that, like, if this is the defense that he presents, like, think about the situation for a moment. I said that, you know, this is the apology that Socrates presents. He literally gets up on the witness stand in front of all of these smart, you know, educated, rich people in Athens, having been accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, and he literally starts his speech with, so, turns out, y'all are morons, and the people who say that they are the smartest people who you keep hiring to teach your children are also morons. And I am the only person who realizes that, you know, I am a moron, and consequently I am less moronic than literally all of you. Did I mention that you're all dumb? Needless to say, this does not go over well. So they convict him, and they condemn him, and he is executed. And I want to stress that this is a constant theme in Plato's dialogues, that he draws attention to the injustice of Socrates' death. Like, every dialogue you read by Plato is Plato banging on the walls saying, guys, you killed Socrates! He was the best of us! He was searching for wisdom! He was trying to learn more, and you killed him, you monsters! All because of your own insecurities, all because of your own fear, all because you couldn't face your own intellectual inferiority. If you could only be like Socrates and know yourself, you would have realized what a great man we had on our hands. You would have realized how foolish you were. Plato will never let these people forget what they did to Socrates. He will never let us think that Socrates was anything else but basically a secular saint who was going around helping everybody and honestly searching for wisdom. That is Plato's take on Socrates. That is most philosophers' take on Socrates. This is the way that Socrates is usually going to be presented to you when you walk into a philosophy class. But like I said, that's just one of the stories here. One of the two sides. We get a kind of different story from the Greek historians running around at the same time. Specifically, while Socrates was running around calling people morons and asking, impertinent questions, there was a war going on, the Peloponnesian War. It's kind of this whole deal. It is recounted by these two guys, Thucydides and Xenophon, and they are pretty quick to talk about Socrates' whole role in these events, and it is not nearly as flattering as Plato would like us to believe. So I want to briefly talk about Socrates' career as far as these historians are concerned, because again, this is relevant to a lot of what's going on in the Symposium for a variety of reasons. So, like I said, at the time of this big war, this Peloponnesian War, there are two major city-states who are sort of the poles of all the action here. Athens is one of them. We'll talk about them in a moment. But the big enemy of Athens here is Sparta. And you've probably heard of Sparta at this point. Like, these are the 300 Spartans who fought off the Persians in the Battle of Thermopylae. Like, you may have heard about how they're, like, these rigorously trained warriors who, from age 7, spend all their time in, like, a barracks learning how to be the perfect soldier. This is effectively a eugenic state where, like, anyone who is born with a physical deformity, or, for that matter, twins, I don't know, it's a religious, superstitious thing. All of them are killed right at the outset because they cannot be the perfect warrior. Like, Sparta has absolutely no tolerance for physical weakness. Everyone has to follow these rigorous guidelines laid down by this dude, like Lycurgus the Lawgiver, and basically life is training for battle the entire time when you are a Spartan. Now, you might think as a consequence that, like, why didn't they just, like, conquer the world, the Spartans? Like, if they have the best heavy infantry in the entire ancient world, and they do, why don't they just, like, show that they are? Like, why don't they flex? But at the same time, the Spartans actually don't do a lot of conquering. Like, as a rule, the Spartan society is divided in two at all times. There's, like, a series of warriors in the field, usually, like, defending the borders or, going to war for pay or whatever. But a large part of the army is always at home. Because the way Spartan society is organized, there's, like, a ton of slaves who do all of the work of keeping up, basically, the entire city and the society at large. These slaves are called helots in Spartan society. And you'll remember when I said a while ago that, like, Athenian slaves are treated really nicely and, they can even buy their own freedom in certain circumstances and it's not nearly as bad as what you'll find in, like, North American slave trade and stuff. Take it all back for Sparta. These guys are brutal. Like, because there are so many slaves in Spartan society, like, at the time that we're talking about, it is assumed that there are roughly 7 helots to every Spartan citizen. As a consequence, like, slave revolts and uprisings happen fairly frequently, and the Spartans need their fighting fit force of, like, elite soldiers to put down the slave uprisings on a regular basis. And they are brutal about this. Like, it is normal Spartan training to, like, go into the helot territory and, like, just randomly kill a bunch of people to keep them in line. Like, this is what you do for fun as a Spartan soldier. Just, again, very militaristic, kind of a messed up society, but at the same time, they're weirdly egalitarian. Like, I know that we talked about how the Athenians are actually super misogynistic, how, women are not even allowed to leave the house under their own steam. But the Spartans, the women are brought up in the same barracks as the men. Like, they are trained to be soldiers the same way the men are. And in fact, it's usually the women who are staying at home, taking care of the household, doing all of the economic things while the men are at war. So women actually own property. In fact, I think there's at least one tradition that holds that, like, it was passed by inheritance from woman to woman instead of man to man. Crazy stuff. The Spartans are actually totally cool with women. The Spartans are surprisingly, like, well structured as a society. It's just they're really into warfare, and they also have a really oppressive social structure that keeps a lot of slaves in line. But this also runs them afoul of the Athenians pretty frequently. Like, again, the Athenians are all about democracy and individual expression and, personal, freedom and stuff. And the Helots like hearing about this, so frequently when, Athenians come to Sparta, there's a lot of friction, and maybe this, they'll inspire the Helots to revolt and stuff. The Spartans are really grumpy about this. I know in the Battle of the 300 and the whole, Greco-Persian War, it's Team Sparta and Team Athens are the same team, and they're friends, and it's because we're all Greek, and so on and so forth. But I want to stress, this is not normal. Sparta and Athens hate each other. They hate each other to death, more often than not. And at this particular moment, Sparta and Athens are in a real fighting mood. Now, Athens, like I said, their whole thing is individual expression and individual freedom. They had this major leader called Pericles over here on the left, who's kind of like Lycurgus in some ways, although honestly the more clear parallel is Solon, long story, not getting into it. Pericles had started off this whole series of Greek public projects, like building the Parthenon on Mars Hill and, all of these other important public buildings like the theaters and stuff. Some of the most famous Greek landmarks are because Pericles commissioned them effectively. After the Greco-Persian War, if I'm not mistaken, the Greeks came into quite a bit of money and loot due to their conquest of what was, at the time, the most important empire in the world. And they basically used all that money for public projects to, make these new buildings, to, ensure the freedom and, the study of literature and art. All that stuff was very much a high priority for the Athenians. But the other thing that they put all their money into was boats. So the Athenians have, the biggest, scariest navy in the ancient world as well. In fact, it's their naval power that causes them to overcome the Persians in the first place. So what I want to stress is, we have, on the one hand, the strongest, heavy infantry in the ancient world, the Spartans, and on the other hand, we have the strongest navy in the ancient world, the Athenians, and the two of them hate each other. Hate each other with a burning passion. But the trouble with, Sparta and Athens going to war with each other in these circumstances is that neither of them can really beat the other one. So the Spartans have the greatest heavy infantry in the world. Great. But the only way that they can, march to Athens is over this tiny little, isthmus here, which would be very easy to defend against a bunch of heavy infantry marching all over the place. And in general, Greece is not friendly to long marches. That's a part of the reason why the Persians got so wrecked. The Persians are used to big, long plains where their light cavalry can, fly over and, attack people by surprise. But it's all rocks and cliffs and mess and islands over here in Greece. So, a land invasion is really not terribly practical, even if you do have the best heavy infantry in the ancient world. But importantly, if the Spartans want to get to Athens, they're going to have to go by boat. And the Athenians have the strongest navy. So there's no way that the Spartans can actually, take over Athens without, either waging a very costly land war or wasting a lot of boats and getting utterly destroyed in transit. But likewise, we'll notice that Sparta's pretty far inland. So if the Athenians want to use their navy to attack Sparta, well, they're going to have to go up this river, which would be really difficult because the boats are not designed for it, and the Spartans would be able to destroy them with their heavy infantry. So we're really at a stalemate here in the Peloponnesian War. No one is getting an advantage on anyone else. And what it really seems to be coming down to is who's on your team. So for both Sparta and Athens, the priority in this war tends to stray towards, okay, who can we recruit to be on our side? And the Spartans are like, well, we can clearly get the Mycenaeans and the Corinthians because they're both right here. And the Athenians are like, well, we'll get the Thebans to hang out with us. And, that all seems pretty obvious. But at the end of the day, Thebes and Corinth and Mycenae, they don't want any part of this war. This is not the first time that Sparta and Athens have thrown down. And at the end of the day, it tends to, hurt the allies more than it does either one of these major cities. So, nobody wants to jump on board with this particular set of alliances. It's kind of a pretty ugly business all around. So, the war just sort of drags. For a long time, we just get no progress whatsoever. But then in Athens, we get this guy, Alcibiades. And yes, if you're curious, this is the same Alcibiades who shows up mysteriously and crashes the party at the end of the Symposium. If you've been reading ahead, or even if you've just flipped through the back couple of pages and saw entry of Alcibiades or Alcibiades' speech, yeah, this guy. And the first thing we need to understand about Alcibiades is that Alcibiades is really hot. Like, I realize that these pictures don't do him justice. Like, we got this later imagination by, like, a classical or neoclassical artist. We've got, like, some statues of Alcibiades, but, you know, they're statues. They don't have color, and, like, our appreciation of the human form is a little different than the Greeks. Fortunately for us, I want to, like, the Assassin's Creed Odyssey actually also did Alcibiades, and, you know, I mean, I see the appeal. Like, again, Alcibiades is hot. You need to remember this, because he is one of the hottest guys in ancient Athens, and as you'll remember, all of the political figures in ancient Athens are really into hot guys at this particular moment in history. Like, Aristophanes was joking about it in his speech. We talked about it in our contextualization episode. All this to say that here is Alcibiades, hot, young, snack Alcibiades, and he suddenly got his ideas about how exactly he wants to see the Peloponnesian War go down. He's got plans for how this war is going to happen. So Alcibiades goes to the Demos, and he's like, guys, I have a plan. Here is my plan. We're going to sail all the way to Sicily. Like, we're going to take all of our boats from Athens, and we're going to sail right along this blue line, like that was totally the plan. Sail all the way over here somewhere to Italy, and here's Sicily. And we're going to sail there, and we're going to get our allies from the colonies. Like, they don't know about the whole Spartan-Athenian fight thing. Like, they're kind of removed from all this, so they don't necessarily have, like, any obvious allegiances, so we can get them over on our side pretty easily. And, you know, we'll, like, go over there and just convince them that the Athenian cause is worthwhile, and they will all love us, and it'll be great. And on the one hand, this sounds like a kind of bad idea. Like, okay, so the main thing that the Athenians have is their giant navy, which is stopping the Spartans from attacking, and we're going to, like, take a whole bunch of the navy, and we're going to go really far in the opposite direction, in a place that is not helpful, in order to get allies, supposedly. And, like, some people bring this up, and they're like, Alcibiades, why do you think that they would join us? And Alcibiades is like, guys, I'm Alcibiades. I can convince anyone to do anything. Have you seen how hot I am? And everyone's like, well, you know, he has a point. He is really hot, after all. And for some reason, either because they've taken leave of their senses or whatever, they go along with it. They're like, you know what, Alcibiades, we'll do it. We will go ahead and we will sail all of our boats, or at least 2/3 of our fleet, all the way over to Sicily, where we'll get all of the allies. And Alcibiades goes along with them. Because, of course, he is crucial to convincing everyone and, you know, being so hot that no one can say no to him and all of those things. And then they finally get to Sicily, and fun fact, turns out the allies that they were going to recruit are actually under attack. Like, other Sicilians and other Italians are currently besieging the city that they were hoping for. So, like, the generals who are on the ships, they all put their heads together and like, okay, so this is a major setback, what do we do? And plan number one is, okay, what if we, like, sneak in under cover of night and, like, attack the besiegers when they're not paying attention. Like, we totally ambush them. And we break the siege, and the city is going to be so grateful that they'll immediately join up with us, and we can sail all the way back to Athens with all these allies, as well as, like, going around Italy and Sicily and getting even more allies, anyone who would have been on their team. All of us will go back and we'll take out the Spartans. And, like, general number two is like, okay, building on that idea, what if we just attack them, like, right now, like, during the day? Like, they don't see us coming, they don't know we're here, we'll just, like, blast forward, break the siege, again, everyone feels super grateful, they all join up with us, we all go back to Sparta, everyone's cool. And then Alcibiades speaks up. So, what if instead we, like, leave, and we go and sail all around Sicily to all the other cities, and we get recruits? Like, we you know, convince them to join us first. And then we can attack, and then we can break the siege, and then they'll join up with us. And the generals are like, dude, we have no guarantee that anyone's going to join up with us. Like, right now, we've got the element of surprise on our side. They don't see us coming. There's enough of us that we can do this. Let's just do this. And also, but Alcibiades is, you know, really hot. So everyone ultimately goes along with him, and they sail around, and lo and behold, they get no allies, and nobody's willing to join up with us because, we're not sure how this whole, thing is going to pan out. So we come back, and it turns out that the city's already been overthrown, and we attack them anyway, trying to defend whoever's left, and the entire Athenian army gets, completely decimated, and half the boats are destroyed, and the whole thing is a giant debacle. The entire Athenian army is devastated by this boondoggle attack on Sicily or this boondoggle attempt to get allies. And then when the generals are turning around well, that was a terrible idea. Where the heck is Alcibiades? They look and he's gone. Turns out that in the middle of all of this nonsense, Alcibiades, turned tail with his boats and he sailed all the way back to Athens and sacked the place. He robbed people. He, defaced public monuments. And then he takes all of his swag and he goes to Sparta. Because he's got family there, as it happens. So this whole thing turns out into a giant mess. Alcibiades does, in fact, hang out with the Spartans for a little while. But then he, sleeps with the Spartan king's wife. And so the Spartans come after him too, and, he gets killed. It's a whole thing, but not necessarily relevant to our discussion. Meanwhile, Athens gets utterly wrecked, and the Spartans put a whole bunch of tyrants in charge of Athens, and they, raise them up, and Athens lives under these tyrants for a long time, and nobody likes it, and everybody hates it, and finally they do overcome the tyrants, but only years afterward, after, the greatest years of Athenian history have passed. The whole thing is a giant freaking mess. And when everyone is sitting around there, before the tyrant showed up, they're asking to themselves, okay, so what do we do about this Alcibiades thing? And they're well, we can't get to Alcibiades. He's currently living in Sparta, where all of our enemies are, so we can't very well do anything about him. So what we need to do is, find the person who is responsible for plotting with Alcibiades. The guy that he spent all the time with. Did he have any teachers or anything? They're well, Alcibiades actually had a lot of teachers. He hung out with Gorgias for a while, but Gorgias was I can't teach this dude, so we got rid of him. And he's okay, so, did he have any other teachers? He's actually, his dad had, a zillion teachers for him, and all of them rejected him. So then they're all okay, so who was the teacher that he was hanging out with the most? Well, the guy who doesn't charge anything. The guy who accepts everyone. Socrates. He was the one who was hanging out with Alcibiades all the time. And possibly plotting with him to overthrow Athens. So, let's just kill Socrates, huh? Yeah, he corrupted the youth of Athens, but that's maybe just the sort of claim here, because there's, one particular youth that may have been corrupted by Socrates into not respecting the gods and not respecting Athenian society because of all these questions and fancy new ideas that Socrates has. Maybe Socrates, poisoned the mind of Alcibiades. Maybe Socrates was actually the one planning this whole betrayal all along. Now, I want to stress, the evidence here is tenuous, but again, our guy Thucydides and Xenophon both kind of insist that actually no, this was really a thing that happened. That, in fact, Socrates and Alcibiades were spending a lot of time together, and in all likelihood, they were, in fact, plotting treason against Athens. Now, Plato doesn't present it that way at all. There's even a moment in the Crito where Socrates is, in jail, and his friends show up to bust him out, and they're hey, Socrates, now's our chance. Under cover of night, we will sneak off, and we will, get you to safety, and you can hide out in some other place. And Socrates is no, I respect the will of Athens too much. If the Demos says I am guilty, then I will stay here and face my punishment. And, flags wave in the background, and, a mournful trumpet plays sadly, and Crito's dude, we should go! And Socrates is no, convince me why, and then we get into the whole Socratic dialogue thing. So all that to say, Plato goes well out of his way to be no, actually, Socrates was super loyal, and he was an Athenian patriot, and, nobody would have convinced him to do anything bad like this. But, again, the historians seem to think, no, actually, he and Alcibiades were really tight, actually. And they probably were trying to take down Athens together. Brains and sex appeal. It's a dangerous combination, folks. So when I say that there are two stories of what's going on here, I want to stress that these two stories are the two ways that we generally see Socrates today. Is he the hero, the guy who, followed wisdom and knowledge to the best of his ability, who, never betrayed his ideals and was always loyal to Athens and his own convictions even when they confronted one another? Or is he the guy who was suckered in by Alcibiades' hotness? Or was he the mastermind behind Alcibiades' crazy traitorous exploits? None of these are necessarily contradictory, but there are two different narratives being presented here, two different ways of squaring the evidence. And I'm not going to say that one is right and one is wrong. I think we need to take both into consideration. At the very least, you need to know both, because Plato knows both. Plato has a side, he has a bias, he's trying to convince us that one story is more true than the other one. But at the very least, you'll notice, especially in the back half of this text, that Plato is going well out of his way to say that this was not a thing. Socrates was not enamored with Alcibiades. He was not seduced by Alcibiades' overflowing handsomeness. He was, in fact, true to his own principles from start to finish. And as we go forward in this text, as we read especially the speech of Alcibiades, keep that in mind. Plato has an agenda here. Whether that agenda is motivated correctly or wrongly, it's hard to say. After all, it's been 2,500 years. None of us were there, and nobody took photographic evidence. We don't have a deep throat who's here is all of my, high telephoto lens pictures of Socrates and Alcibiades colluding to overthrow Athens. Again, what we've got is what we've got. We've got some historians, we've got some philosophers, everybody is biased, everybody has insufficient information. We're doing the best we can. But we, as people, want a story. We want heroes and villains. We want traitors, and we want, people who are beyond corruption. We want Socrates to be a saint, or we want him to be a monster. And therefore, the versions of Socrates you'll hear about in the classroom tend to skew one way or the other. What I want to stress is you will have to decide. Was Socrates a traitor? Was Socrates a hero? You'll probably have to make that decision, either in the papers to come in this class, or maybe down the road if you find yourself bumping into him again. Whatever the case may be, keep in mind that there are multiple takes on this. That hearing one of these stories as opposed to the other may not give you the whole picture. That's the lesson that our history department wants to insist upon here in this class. And that's what I want to teach you, so you are better equipped to look at the people that are raised up as heroes or tyrants, and to question those assumptions as well. To recognize that we have this deep inclination to weave facts into stories, to sort of connect the dots when all we have are dots. And the connections we make aren't necessarily logical or correct, but rather suit that desire to make a compelling story, one way or the other. We're going to have these moments again, frequently in this class. I'm going to, break ranks and talk about, okay, let's talk about two stories of Socrates, or two stories of Rome, or two stories of, the medieval world, whatever the case may be. I want to get us to start thinking about these things in multiple ways. Because at the same time as Plato is telling us that we can understand love in a wide variety of ways, we should be primed to understand a lot of things in a wide variety of ways. We should be ready to look at most of the philosophical concepts we're kicking around from a variety of ways, to look for their truth and also for their falsehood, to look for the ways that they are compelling and interesting and that actually inform us more about the nature of love, and to understand the ways that they are actually covering over important parts of love and the relationships we have. We should recognize that Agathon is telling the truth when he describes love as being good and just and virtuous all the time, and we should also recognize that this might be actually a little incomplete. So going forward, there will not be one story in this class. There will almost always be two or more. Now, this will go along with our discussion of Socrates' speech, so if you haven't already, go and listen to that. And we'll talk more about Socrates, his legacy, and of course, the sexy Alcibiades very soon.